And now we move on to the final discussion of the evening, which might be worth its own program, given some of the questions we've been getting. But for the first time in quite a while, we have two registered ballot question campaigns, a pro and a con. So we are able to have a representative from each campaign join us tonight for a discussion of the ballot issue. First, let me read the ballot question to be sure everyone knows what is being discussed. The question that will be on your ballot on April 6th is, shall the town of Belmont be allowed to assess an additional $6,400,000 in real estate and personal property taxes for the purposes of supplementing the capital budget and the town and school operating budgets for a fiscal year beginning on July 1st, 2021, yes or no? Speaking in favor of the question, we have Nicole Dorn, Chair of Yes for Belmont. And against the question, we have Bill Anderson, representative of No Override Now. So I see Ms. Dorn and Mr. Anderson, if you will unmute and you're turned on your videos. And since yes is the first option on the ballot, Ms. Dorn will start with an opening statement. And for the opening statements on this question, we're giving you 90 seconds instead of 2 minutes. So Ms. Dorn, your 90 seconds on yes.
Thank you so much to the League of Women Voters for hosting this event tonight, and thank you to everyone who's watching at home. My name's Nicole Dorn, and I'm the chair of Yes for Belmont. This vote comes down to one basic question. Are we going to come together as a community and preserve what we love about Belmont in the most cost-effective way, or are we going to go backwards as a town and place an even greater burden on residents in the future? Belmont has a structural deficit, meaning it costs us more each year to provide the basic minimum level of services. This was not caused by the pandemic or by any kind of mismanagement. It stems from a historic surge in school enrollment and rising healthcare costs. As the town of homes, we are mostly reliant on residential property taxes to cover these expenses. By aggressively cutting costs and increasing revenue, we stretched the 2015 override from 3 years to 6. But we've only passed one operating override in the last 18 years, and as a result, Belmont already runs lean. Our structural deficit of close to $20 million over the next 3 years won't be solved by any delay or by a one-time infusion of federal funds that are either restricted or needed for planned COVID expenses next year. And there is a cost to doing nothing. After the failed override in 2010, our roads and sidewalks fell apart, and our high school students had actual classes replaced with free periods. If we don't pass this override, we will face similar cuts and need a more expensive override next year to avoid even larger and more devastating cuts. Elections matter. Please join me in voting yes on April 6th to ensure a brighter future for our students, our seniors, and everyone in between. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Bill Anderson, and I believe this is the wrong time to permanently raise your taxes. My wife and I have been Belmont residents and taxpayers for 24 years. We've faithfully funded our share of the town's needs and done our part to maintain and improve our excellent schools. We are proud parents of a 14-year-old Belmont High freshman who benefited greatly from his time at both Winbrook and Chenery. We supported both the Wellington and the high school building projects, but I cannot support this $6.4 million override. In my 35-year finance career, I've earned a CPA and managed finances and budgets at KPMG, State Street, and Bank of America, and I now serve as fiscal director at the Cambridge Housing Authority. Raising taxes now is the wrong thing to do, as many remain out of work and struggle to make ends meet. Seniors and renters will pay higher taxes and rents in a town whose taxes per household are already some of the highest in the state. And most importantly, the American Rescue Plan will give Belmont over $8 million, which must be fully understood before we can even know if an override is necessary. Now, folks, I would never ask you to harm your town or our schools. The fact is, if this override fails, our town services will still be there, our new school will open on time, and our kids will continue to receive an excellent education. In this historic pandemic, with over 8 million recovery dollars right on our doorstep, now is not the time to permanently raise taxes.
Thank you. We have gotten, you might guess, quite a number of questions. We will alternate who goes first, and you'll have 1 minute each to answer these questions. So the first question, and we'll start with Mr. Anderson, is what benefits will the override make possible? And how would I determine how much the override will increase my taxes?
Well, I mean, you can go to the town's website. There's a calculator there, and it'll tell you how much your taxes will increase. But the number's around $1,273 on average per household in Belmont. And the benefits of the override, we'll be imposing taxes on a permanent tax increase on our people right at the time when the American Rescue Plan is intended to do the opposite. It's intended to provide relief. Yet we would be imposing more of a burden on our people, on our seniors who are already scared about being able to continue to afford to live in this town, about our struggling young families that some people are out of work and will have to choose whether or not they stay in this town, take their kids away from their friends. It's simply not the time to raise taxes on our people.
Thank you, Ms. Dorn.
So first, I want to correct something. In fact, the average increase from the override for a $1.3 million house would be $888, not $1,200. Second, it's important to keep in mind that when the override passes, one, we'll be able to make progress in terms of class sizes across all of our schools. We reduced overcrowded classrooms at the elementary school from 42% to 10% since 2015. All of that progress will be lost if the override fails, but if it passes, we can continue to reduce class sizes across all of our grades. We can ensure that we can maintain our libraries, hours, and programs. This is not about adding bells and whistles for our town and our schools. This is about preserving what we already have. But the most important benefit of passing the override this April is that ensures we don't have to have a more expensive override in the future. Every year we delay, the problem only gets bigger. And so this is actually the most cost-effective mechanism to solve our structural deficit for our taxpayers.
Thank you. Second question, starting with Ms. Dorn, is what does the town look like in 2 or 3 years if the override passes or fails?
Well, so first, if the override fails, we will be playing catch up. We will have dug ourselves into an even deeper hole. And as I mentioned, we will be actually putting a greater tax burden on families. The problem is only going to get worse and only going to get bigger if we delay. We will have lost all the progress we would have made in reducing class sizes since 2015. Class sizes will go up across all grades. We will not have the services to support our students. And we also will have a real impact on our town services, everything from the library to parks and playgrounds. We could risk losing our accreditation in the Minuteman network. And we'll be worse off as a town. I don't think that's going to happen. This override will pass, and we'll be able to, again, like I said, in 2 to 3 years, have made critical progress on class sizes. We will have invested in critical repairs in a cost-effective manner. We will have ensured we can preserve our town services, and we will continue to pursue structural reform to make sure that any overrides we do have are manageable for taxpayers and are few and far between.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson? Again, what does Belmont look like in 2 or 3 years if the override passes or fails?
I don't think anybody can tell you what the town's going to look like in 2 or 3 years. We have $8 million that's about to drop into our checking account, and that money is intended to directly benefit the town and its people for the negative economic impacts of the past year, and it's to supplement the losses of government revenue. And these are things that need to be fully understood before we can go layering in a permanent increase in taxes. This is just not the time to do it.
Can I have a rebuttal?
30 seconds and then 30 seconds again from Mr. Anderson.
So it's important to keep in mind, while the $8.6 million is good for Belmont, it cannot all be used for our operating expenses. We have a $20 million deficit over the next 3 years. And our current estimate is that only $700,000 from those federal funds could be used to cover our operating expenses. Most of it is restricted, and it's needed for planned COVID expenses next year, like the testing that they were just talking about in the school committee debate. So we need this override now. We have a $20 million deficit over the next 3 years. The federal funding is not going to address that gap.
Mr. Anderson, do you want to respond again?
You cannot say that this money is not going to address anything that we need the money for. This is recovery money. This is intended to supplement our budgets and intended to prevent layering in new taxes on our people. It is intended to prevent additional burdens and to relieve us from the burdens that are out there right now. Senator Brownsberger's website says that when the regulations are issued, they will likely continue to evolve to loosen restrictions, and that's been the pattern all along. This is money that's available.
Thank you. The next question starts with Mr. Anderson. If the override does not pass, will the town be faced with a higher override next year?
You know, like I said, I don't know that we have a budget for next year. There's way too many uncertainties with $8 million about to drop into our checking account. I don't see how anybody can say we know what's going to happen next year. And we have people that are struggling. You know, we have businesses that are failing. We have people that are moving. We have seniors who are planning on moving out of town or having to make difficult decisions about how they stay here. We cannot say what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years. There's just way too many uncertainties.
Ms. Dorn?
So we actually have had a financial task force that has been looking at this issue for the past 3 years. All of their information is available on the town's website. The warrant committee has also been looking at this issue for the past few years. Mark Palillo, who's a member of the financial task force, they all voted unanimously when studying this issue that this is something that we need to pass now, because any further delays is going to just result in a bigger override next year. And the federal fund does not change that equation. Our deficit, as I said, is projected to be $20 million over the next 3 years. That is after spending down free cash. So that assumes that we use all of our free cash in a responsible way over the next 3 years. If not, it would be $31 million deficit that we're facing. So there is no way that we can avoid a bigger override at any time in the future if we don't pass the override this April. Now, I certainly empathize with those who are struggling to pay property taxes. We can and should continue to support them. But if the override fails, it will also have a disproportionate impact on families who are struggling. And I also worry about that impact.
Thank you. You both touched a bit on this question, but here it is again. And we'll start with Ms. Dorn. Do you think people should be rethinking their position on the override due to the federal COVID-19 relief package announced last week?
No, I don't. And I'll explain to you why. So first of all, this money is good for Belmont. It's good for Belmont residents who are struggling, and it's good for Belmont small businesses. But it's important to remember that this money is intended to address impacts from COVID. And our structural deficit is not related to the pandemic. It's because our expenses, what it costs to provide basic minimum level of services, is increasing faster than our revenue. We also know what the restrictions on the uses are. It's for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. It's to compensate frontline and essential workers. It's to address the COVID expenses. We always knew we would have COVID expenses next year for our schools and our towns, and always planned to cover the cost of those expenses with these federal dollars. You can use some of the money for lost revenue, but that's estimated to only be $700,000. You can't cover a $20 million gap over 3 years with $700,000. And if we delay, the problem is only going to get bigger, and we are just going to put a greater burden on taxpayers in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Should people be rethinking their position on the override due to the federal COVID-19 relief package announced last week?
Yes, they absolutely should. They absolutely should, because this $8 million is new money. This was not contemplated at the time that the town decided that they should put a $6.4 million override on the ballot. Senator Brownsberger clearly states that we should not, no town should be making any override decisions at all, regardless of which side you're on, because of this money, which means that we should not be making a decision to vote in an override, given the fact that we have this money out here and the regulations will very likely continue to evolve to loosen spending category limitations. We will have opportunities to use this money for the things that we need. And this money is also intended to put people back to work. Okay, let's not forget that. This is not just about funding some deficit. This is about putting people back to work and getting us back on our feet.
Can I offer a rebuttal?
Let me go on, because we've got a lot of questions and they tend to be a little bit repetitive, so you may get a chance.
Okay, thank you.
With this question, we'll start with Mr. Anderson. It is, how important is the override to resuming normal educational activities after COVID?
Well, I think that the fact that I've lived in this town for over 23 years and we've had excellent schools all along, year in and year out, we'll continue to have excellent schools. I mean, the fact is that a lot of the headcount ads in the budget, you know, are new ads. There's no cuts happening. These would be cuts to things that aren't already out there. You can't cut something that's not there. Okay, this is not. I'm sorry, I lost track of the question. Can you answer again, please?
How important the override is to resuming educational activities after COVID.
You know, like I said, our new school is going to open on time. Our kids will continue to get an excellent education either way.
Ms. Dorn?
Passing the override is critical to making sure that we don't prolong the impact of the pandemic on our students. Our kids have had probably one of the hardest years of their lives this past year. If the override fails, we will have to cut $2 million from the school budget next year. That means we will have to eliminate 21 positions. 11 of those positions are existing staff members, and 7 of them are existing teachers that will be laid off if the override fails. We also will have to cut 40% of the budget for athletics, music, theater, and the arts. And I personally can't stomach the fact that while every other district in the Commonwealth will be thinking about how to support students and address the gaps resulting from the pandemic, our district might be discussing which freshman sports team to cut. This override is absolutely necessary to make sure we send our students back to school with more resources and more support, not less.
Okay, and there's yet another question on the schools and the override.
Can I offer a rebuttal?
No, because the questions are very similar, so you can probably make your points as we go on. This question was, Belmont has added 900 students to its school system in the last 13 years. In light of this increased enrollment, what do you think is the best way to maintain the same level of basic services across town for everybody, from seniors to students? And we start with Ms. Dorn on this one.
Well, you know, the fact of the matter is that, yes, because we have added 900 students over the last 13 years, that's why we ultimately have, you know, the structural deficit. Our costs to provide the basic minimum level services are rising faster than our revenue. Now, our enrollment went down by 280 students from last year compared to this year, but most of those, 40%, was pre-kindergarten and kindergarten students. Kindergarten registration is happening now. We know what our enrollment is going to be next year and is on track to be at pre-pandemic levels. Frankly, the fact of the matter is the only way to ensure that we can continue to maintain basic services across the town and our schools is by passing the override. Because we've only passed one operating override in 18 years, Belmont already runs lean. We haven't added headcount to the town in 10 years. There simply isn't any more fat to cut at either the schools or either the town. And that's why we need to pass the override now, and it's the fiscally responsible choice.
And Mr. Anderson?
Could you repeat the question again?
I will. Belmont has added 900 students to its school system in the last 13 years. In light of this increased enrollment, what is the best way to maintain the same level of basic services across town for everyone, from seniors to students?
Well, we were already maintaining the funding that's needed for our schools. The 900 students that have been added over the last 13 years, we had an override in 2005 that addressed those. We had an override back then that added the headcount that was needed to continue to teach those. Those jobs are already out there. Belmont has increased taxes every single year. We have maybe had one override, we've had a debt exclusion, but we've had increased taxes every year. 12 tax increases in 20 years, 5 in the past 10, and 4 in the past 6. We cannot continue to simply add taxes to add 32 new people to the school. 40% of those are not teachers. Now's not the time to do this. It is not the time for an override.
Thank you. And this will be the last question before your closing statements. And we'll start with Mr. Anderson. And the person who sent it in said, I read that Belmont is dangerously close to underfunding its library, and this may cause us to drop out of the Minuteman network. How will the override support the library? Mr. Anderson.
You know, All I can say is that I don't specifically know how much of the override money is intended to go to the library, but we do have $8 million of pandemic relief funds that can be used, and regulations will prove this out. As those regulations are given to us by the United States Treasury, and as those regulations loosen the spending category limitations, we already have towns and cities in neighboring states that are planning on using this money to address deferred maintenance on their buildings. I mean, this is a real possibility, and we should not be layering in additional taxes right now, adding another burden on our taxpayers when we have relief money coming to us that is intended to do exactly the opposite.
Thank you, Ms. Dorn. Do you need the question again?
No, that's okay. So one thing I did want to mention too is that, Representative Clark's office said that towns should not be making decisions about any overrides based on this relief funding. And that's what they meant, is that we shouldn't be adjusting our plans. That money is meant for COVID related expenses, and it's highly restricted. And we have expenses next year that aren't in our budget and that we're planning to use the federal funds for. But let me get back to your question about the library. The library is one of our most treasured resources in our community, and it is vastly underfunded. And we are barely above the level that we need to fund the library to avoid losing our accreditation in the Minuteman network. If the override fails, that will be at even greater risk. And the fact of the matter is, if it fails, we'll have to shut down. They'll have to reduce hours at the library, reduce programs. So, it's a treasured resource in our community. Passing the override makes sure that we can maintain the services the library offers and really preserve the services that all members of our town offer in the most cost-effective way for taxpayers.
Thank you. We come now to closing statements on this pretty controversial issue. And since Ms. Dorn went first as an opening statement, Mr. Anderson will go first for closing statement. 1 minute. Mr. Anderson, you're muted. Mr. Anderson, unmute. There you go.
Thank you. Yes, this is a very controversial issue, and it involves all levels of our town, all the people that live in this town, and all the people that are going to have to make difficult decisions when if new taxes are imposed. But I do want to thank the League and all of you at home for listening. And folks, we have had a difficult year, and we are still struggling through this pandemic. Restaurants and shops have closed. Some of them are just hanging on. Many people are out of work, and more than a few are behind on rent and mortgage payments. Our taxes have increased every year, most notably with the high school debt exclusion. Our town faces a deficit, yet this override asks us to fund some 35 permanent new adds to staff. The middle of the historic pandemic, with $8 million of federal rescue money on the way, is the wrong time to raise taxes on homeowners who already pay some of the highest taxes in Massachusetts. Despite what you've heard, the overriding failing will not ruin Belmont. Our town services will still be there. Our new school will open on time, and our kids will continue to receive a excellent Belmont education. Please join me in voting no on question 1.
Thank you. Ms. Dorn?
Thank you. A yes vote on the override is needed to preserve our town services and support our students now when they need it more than ever. It ensures we can send our kids back to school with the resources they need, and that we maintain a basic minimum level of services across our entire town, from our library to our parks and playgrounds and everywhere in between. The fundamental fact is there is a cost to doing nothing that all of us will have to bear. Delaying the override means having to make significant cuts to our schools and our town this summer. And if we don't pass the override at April 6th, we would require a more expensive override at any time in the future to avoid devastating cuts across the board. The problem only gets bigger if we wait. Belmont has passed only one operating override in the past 18 years. We are now facing a multi-year $20 million deficit that won't go away if we delay and won't be solved by a one-time infusion of restricted federal aid. Passing the override now is the fiscally responsible choice. And for that reason, I'm confident we'll come together as a community on April 6th and do what is needed to preserve the future of our town. Thank you.
Thank you both. And that brings this candidates forum to an end.